Dr. Marjorie Woollacott, on behalf of Michael and Ian and Philip Baldwin and the Marion Institute, welcome to the Three Brothers Quest.
And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
We are so glad to have you. Can we begin with NDEs, near-death experiences? What is an NDE and why do NDEs matter in terms of the human journey?
Very good question. And you did help me really go back and contemplate all that I know about NDEs in answering that. Excuse me. And in the most stringent definition, these are accounts of experiences people report when their body, and that naturally means including their brain, was judged by the medical staff to be non-functioning. That is, to be dead. And so those cases typically occur during cardiac arrest. And in the current medical practice, many patients in such a state are able to be revived, and about 20 to 25% say later that they were conscious at the time their brain was not functioning. And the experiences tend to range from narratives about what was happening in the resuscitation room at the time of that patient's cardiac arrest, also to things that were going on elsewhere in the hospital or even elsewhere in the town, as well as meeting dead loved ones from the other side and visiting other realms. And you asked, what do they really reveal about our larger human experience? And I would say that they're the most convincing data we have that conscious awareness is not solely the product of the neurons in our brain. As these individuals are fully aware, often they say that they are hyper aware when they're under cardiac arrest and have flat EEG. And just giving you a bit of a background on NDEs, I went back actually to remind myself that the first time the term NDE was actually coined was in 1975 by Raymond Moody, an MD who wrote this book, Life After Life. And I think it was interesting that he had interviewed 150 people and then wrote down what he believed were like the core aspects of a near-death experience, including being out of the body, going through a tunnel, rising to the heavens, seeing people that weren't present, etc. And what was interesting to me is then another person, Kenneth Ring, who was a PhD in psychology and a scientist, picked this data up and said, I want to understand what's really going on from a scientific perspective. So then Kenneth Ring actually wrote articles. The first one was in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, and it had in it the experience that has now become famous, that in fact, Kimberly Clark Sharp actually witnessed as a social worker. And that's the one where this woman has cardiac arrest in a hospital in Seattle. And when she comes back, she tells the social worker, Kimberly, I saw this blue tennis shoe on the outside ledge of a window in another part of the hospital. And Kimberly was just not really believing this. I mean, from her own background, it seemed impossible, but she went ahead and looked and she found the tennis shoe exactly as the woman had described it. In fact, well worn, all these things about it. And so when that then went into Kenneth Ring's paper, it really started a sensation in a certain sense. It's like, wow, here's an example that was so exact and so impossible to see with the five senses. So just a reminder too about the studies now that have been done by people like Kenneth Ring and others. That particular study was what we would call a retrospective study. He simply asked people like Kimberly Clark Sharp, had she heard about something like this or experienced something in a patient, and then she gave her information. But there's also prospective studies. And as a neuroscientist, these are the ones that are considered the most credible, the most valid. And that's because now what you do is you have a set of doctors in a network of hospitals go to their human subject committee and say, I want to do a prospective study in which I enroll in the study everyone in this network of hospitals that has cardiac arrest. And if they survive, then we will interview them and ask them what happened during cardiac arrest. And it's usually for like something like a 2-year period or more. And then they interview all those people. And of course, Pim van Lommel was one of those people that did one of these studies that is now well known. It was published in 2001, and it was published in the Lancet Journal, which is number 2 in what we would call credibility of all the medical journals. So very, very highly ranked. And what he did is he enrolled 344 patients in his study with cardiac arrest. And he found that 41 of the patients, that's 12%, responded that they had what we would call a core near-death experience. And of those, 24% actually said that they recalled what was going on in the room during their resuscitation. And of course, he then tells this one story, which I'd love to share with you because it was phenomenal as far as I'm concerned. The story goes this way. The nurse now is telling the story about what happened when this patient comes in. It's during a night shift. He's brought in an ambulance, and he's 44 years old, and he's comatose. So he's brought into the coronary care unit, and he's been found about an hour earlier in a meadow by a passerby. After admission, he receives artificial respiration and defibrillation, and they begin to intubate the patient to get him to have some air, and they realize he has dentures. And so the nurse removes the dentures and puts them in what is called a crash car. And then they continued that extensive CPR. And after 90 minutes, the patient had sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure. He was still intubated, but he was now not, he was able to breathe through with the ventilator, but he was still comatose. And they then transferred him to the intensive care unit, and he began to recover. Now, 1 week later, the nurse met the patient again to give him some medication. And he says to the nurse, "Oh, that nurse knows where my dentures are." Now, the nurse was surprised, and he said, "Excuse me, you were actually comatose." And the patient says, "You were there when I was brought into the hospital, and you took my dentures out of my mouth, and you put them into that car. It had all those bottles on it," he said, "and it had the sliding door, and underneath, that's where you put my teeth." Now, the nurse was especially amazed because he remembered this happening when the man was in deep coma in the process of CPR. Now, when the nurse asked further, he said he'd seen himself lying on the bed, and above, he had watched the nurses and doctors busy with the CPR. And he was able to describe correctly in detail the small room in which he'd been resuscitated, as well as the appearance of the nurse and everybody else present. Now, at the time, he also said he was afraid that they would stop CPR and he was going to die. And the nurse said it was true, that they had been very negative about his prognosis because he was in very poor condition when he was admitted. And he said he desperately tried to make it clear to them that he was still alive and that they should continue the CPR, but he was unsuccessful. He couldn't get it across to them. He also said he was now no longer afraid of death. And 4 weeks later, he left the hospital as a healthy man. Now, at the end of this article that Pim van Lommel is writing, he concludes, he says, "The thus far assumed, but never proven concept that consciousness and memories are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death with flat EEG?" And I think he was saying that in a very conservative way. It should be discussed because what he probably really wanted to say is, listen to me. This shows that our materialist point of view needs to be expanded to include phenomena like this. So I think that really tells us that consciousness is not tied to the functional activity of the brain. So that's perhaps one of the best studies that I know of that helps me at least believe that there's much more to material reality than I thought when I was a young neuroscientist.
So beautifully said. And could we linger for a moment on the fear of death? It does seem in reading your work and others on near-death experiences that NDEs seem to have a profound influence on individuals who come back. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I wrote an article again with Jeffrey Long, who has a website where he actually collects stories of all near-death experiencers who want to submit to his website. And we wrote an article on transformation after near-death experiences. And I think we were looking at close to like maybe 900 people that had submitted these experiences. And when we looked at the data, they were statistically significantly different than people who had almost died but not had a near-death experience in their lack of fear of death. Something happens, not just being near death, but having this experience that makes you understand that consciousness is fundamental, that you are not this physical body, that you are more than this physical body, and that everything's going to be fine when you die because you just went through it. You just had your heart stop and you saw that you were now still aware, still present, and in fact, able to perceive everything that was going on. And you could imagine that it's like the ego says, well, then why was I afraid? So I think it's also beautiful that very often they also see people that were previously in their family that are now deceased and on the other side. And they also have that sense of the continuity. It's not just that you are pure awareness, you are in a context where you have connections with all those people in your family, friends, et cetera, that mean so much to you. And you can continue your communication with them in this beautiful way.
Mm. How have materialist scientists responded to NDE research over the past few decades?
As you can imagine, that if one has a strong belief that material reality is the basis of all the world, like I did when I was a young neuroscientist, it's very hard to figure out how this could happen.
Mm.
And if that belief is strong enough, like it is in most scientists, because we were actually given this information from the time we were like a freshman in college all the way through graduate school and our career, we don't know how to like let go of that belief as true and be curious about other possibilities. So I would say that in fact, before I had my own meditation awakening and experience, I did not read any articles on near-death experiences. They had been out there for probably like 25 or 30 years. And they were in PubMed, which is the national database for scientific research. But would I type in near-death experience and look to see what had been published? Of course not, because I didn't believe it was possible. You know, what people say is, I'm not interested in that. That's usually their response. I'm not interested in that. And you're thinking, but why not? I mean, it might give you a different understanding of the nature of consciousness. So that's the answer. And to this day, whenever many of us give talks at conferences, there will be somebody that comes up afterwards that is, in fact, a materialist, and they will give us all the reasons why we may be wrong. And all you can say is that's often the case that they will say, but you know, I know that sometimes this particular thing happens, or sometimes that particular thing could happen. Like maybe it's low oxygen in the blood and therefore the brain that's causing abnormal hallucinations. And then you say, but remember, there in fact was no activity in the brain. There couldn't be a hallucination because nothing was going on. So that's the interesting conversation that we have. And all I ask my friends that are materialists, like I used to be, is if they could just be curious and look at the data, look at the papers that are out there. And one thing that, in fact, a friend of mine actually suggested was that we actually get together with people that are highly skeptical and we decide how we would create an experiment that would be satisfying for them and for us to show that then, whatever the outcome is, we're happy with. And here's an interesting thing. I just want to mention that a few times people doing these experiments, whether it might be Bruce Grayson or others that have been doing research in hospitals, say, okay, we'll try one particular thing. In fact, Sam Parnia did this as well. They're going to put a particular piece of paper with something on it. You know, it might be a set of numbers or something like that high up in the hospital resuscitation room around the hospital, saying that, well, if the person does leave their body, they might see that and tell us about it. Interestingly, I don't think that has ever worked. And here is one very interesting reason that is the paradox about this. In a highly emotional situation, like just having had your heart stop and being in the midst of resuscitation, you're not interested in looking on a shelf for a number to tell somebody when you get back to your physical body. You are interested in what's going on around you and then going on to have interesting interactions with other people, having a complete life review. It's like a number on a shelf. You expect me to remember that? So I think it's one of those things where what I would call my linear thinking brain thought, well, that's an interesting thing to try. But in fact, it's not emotionally valent. And that's one thing I
Mm.
just want to mention right now, because the same thing is true about many events that we might call telepathic. For example, when your dad dies in a city on the other side of the country, and you instantly know that he's died, and you can actually see him in that moment of his death and hear
Mm.
maybe something he's saying to you. Um, that's because it's emotionally valent, and that's why that comes through in your experience. And so, if we want to do experiments like this that satisfy the skeptic and those people that have a tendency to be curious and want to understand more, we might say, make sure it's emotionally valent to the person. And
Mm.
you'll have a much higher success rate in having them remember something that is emotionally valent.
That's a really beautiful illustration. Um, so before we move on, it seems safe to say that based on NDE research, human beings are creatures beyond bodies alone.
Yes.
Is
That's
that,
what the people who've had the experience also say.
yeah, that's astonishing. Well, let's consider. I've so enjoyed immersing myself in your work and your book, Infinite Awareness: The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. It's such a beautiful book. And can you describe a little bit how you came to be a neuroscientist and then how you moved beyond that? That's a big two-part question, but it's so fascinating.
Yes, thank you. And it does take some explaining. So, as I mentioned in my book, Infinite Awareness, since I was very young, I loved to explore the material world around me. And I remember again at the age of 5, here I was with my older sister. She reminds me she was there too, dissecting a gopher that my mother had killed because it was building tunnels across our front lawn. And we lived on this 1 acre farm, and my mother raised animals to feed our family. So I was used to the idea of animals dying and their bodies being put to use. And I knew we weren't going to eat that gopher, but when I saw his carcass 6 inches long lying in the grass, I was very curious about what was inside of it. So we went to the kitchen, got a paring knife, and I cut into its soft belly. And of course, what emerged were these glistening little packets, which were all of his internal organs, and that fascinated me. Now, had no idea how they fit together, what their functions were, but I was entranced by seeing the mysteries sort of underneath the surface of the physical world. And I think that it was then probably that my vocation as a scientist was set. I loved exploring the material universe. However, I also remember later on in high school having an amazing 11th grade literature teacher, Mr. John O'Neill, who introduced us to Socrates and Plato and the allegory of the cave, from which I understood that there's much more to the world than what we see through the five senses. Just a reminder to listeners that might not know it, people are basically chained in chairs looking at shadows on a cave wall. One person is allowed to be unchained and basically has to be almost dragged up toward the top of the cave toward the light because he can't see anything within this extra bright lightness. And then once he has adapted to this world above the cave, he goes, oh my goodness, this is what reality was. He tries to tell his friends back in the cave when he goes back down, and they say, excuse me, it's not true. And they would be very happy to basically kill him so that he doesn't spread this misinformation. So that was Plato's allegory of the cave. And when I heard that, I thought, oh, maybe there is something more. And I was fascinated by this. And the other thing Mr. O'Neill introduced me to was the work of William James, who is the father of our modern psychology, and his writings on the concept that the brain might filter out a wider awareness. But then, 2 years later in college, when I took my first biology and psychology courses, I was told by my professors that our awareness is completely tied to brain activity. It's foolish to think otherwise. They gave me all the data about this, and I trusted that my university professors knew the truth. And that then is what determined my moving forward in that career as a neuroscientist. And so then when I was a doctoral student, I narrowed my questions about reality to the simple one. I was asking whether a very simple animal's brain can actually create its behavior. So
Mm.
down to the material body and brain and how that produces our experience. And this little sea creature I was studying was called Navanax. And it's actually this exquisite little animal. It's about the size of a gopher. It's taupe in color. It has gold and blue feet or fins, what they call parabodia, that it swims with. And I would sit up late at night in my neuroscience laboratory at the University of Southern California doing experiments on the simple nervous system of this little creature. And through this process that's rather complex, I'd cut into the back of the Navinax, and I would take this glass tube microelectrode that would record from neurons. I'd impale one of
Mm.
its golden neurons, and then I would hear the activity on this audio monitor I had set up in my laboratory as two neurons would be talking to each other. And it would go like brr, brr, brr. I'd hear them back and forth talking. And it was so exciting to me to think that I was hearing neurons in that animal's little brain talking to each
Mm.
other and actually showing me what the underlying hidden reality of all of us was about. So I felt like I was eavesdropping on that secret conversation. So that's what got me to begin to start to understand principles I might later apply to a more complex brain like our own. And that's because, of course, I believed consciousness is solely the product of neurons in
Mm.
the brain. That was my role model, my model of the universe.
And
But yeah,
how old are you now
I am at that
at
age
this point? Yeah.
24 years old.
Okay. Okay. So from the 5-year-old gopher to the 24-year-old Nevin. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So yes, an interesting progression.
Yeah.
Yes. But then now I have done a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Oregon for a few years, and I'm now getting ready for my first professorship at a university in Virginia. And that summer, my sister, who has been studying meditation with an Indian master of meditation, says, Marjorie, we're going to be both together on the East Coast. You're in Virginia, I'm in the Catskill Mountains of New York. Why don't you spend your birthday with me and I'll give you a birthday present of a meditation weekend retreat? Now, I should mention that I was skeptical. I'm a materialist, but I was also curious because I'd had an experience with her at my parents' house in Arizona earlier, where I felt something inside of me that seemed more than just my own five senses.
Mm.
So here's what happened. So I go to the retreat, and I'm told that the Swami, the meditation master, is going to come around the room and initiate every individual there during the first meditation. Now, again, I'm skeptical, but I'm curious, and I decide to go ahead and stay with it. And what happens when he comes around the room is that he touches me on the bridge of my nose, right between the eyes. And when he does that, I feel an electrical current that almost feels like a mini lightning bolt go
Mm.
from his fingers down to the center of my chest. And I can feel the exact place where it stops. It's my heart, not the physical heart, but more like a heart than the physical
Mm.
heart ever seemed. And now I feel this energy radiating from the heart, going all through my being and beyond. And it feels like nectar. It feels like this pure love
Mm.
pouring through me. And there's this feeling of this loving, unconditional connection with everything else in the world.
Mm.
And words go to mind, nothing to do with scientific analysis. I'm home. I'm home. My
Mm.
heart is my home. That's the first time those words had ever come to me in my life. And what's most amazing to me is that I then went back at the end of the weekend to my university position in Virginia. I wake up the next morning at 5 a.m. spontaneously, and I get up to meditate. And it's because I knew at this deep level that just beneath my surface of my awareness simmered this quiet ecstasy. And I touched it in that meditation retreat, and I knew it was there waiting for me if I could just go back and find that again. And so I've been meditating ever since. So I think that's then what shifted me. But I should say that when that happened, I then asked myself, wait a minute, what is reality all about? It's like it created this shift in my worldview. And I had now a professional dilemma. And I kept asking myself, is my worldview Newtonian, just based on my five senses and material reality? Or could it be more than that? And I
Mm.
asked, what is conscious awareness? Is it tied to my neural activity, or could it be more than that? So I think what happened is that awakening created this longing inside of me to understand this deeper nature of reality that I had tasted in those moments.
Mm.
I should say that caused me then to go and get a master's degree in Asian studies to actually explore that further and to really begin to try to put those two halves of my life together.
So you've been running two lives in parallel for decades now, one as a neuroscientist and the other as a curious, I would say, meditator and a curious neuroscientist. And that really is, for those audience members who have not read your book, this is the story you tell in Infinite Awareness. And It really is quite astonishing. Um, I want to pick up on back to the brain and balancing materialism and meditation. Um, we've heard you describe our human brains as filters. You mentioned this a few minutes ago, both receivers and transmitters of consciousness. Can you explain what you mean a little bit more deeply by this filter? Is it a theory? Filter
Sure,
theory?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in fact, my proposal is that there are these filters within the brain associated with my perception and my cognition, my thinking, that actually obscure this wider, more expanded awareness of the universe around us. And I believe they are critical aspects of our daily life. We couldn't exist without them. So, that's an important first point. And as I mentioned earlier, it was William James, the father of our American psychology, that was one of the first researchers to propose that we had these filters to a vaster awareness. I think we often only look in our psychology courses at his more materialist understanding of psychology and the brain, but this is a part of him that he gave beautiful erudite lectures on. And I'm sad that sometimes, again, we push that out of our central awareness about him.
And this is in the varieties of religious experience, right?
Exactly.
Where James
Exactly.
writes in this way. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another set of lectures, I think from Scotland, where he was made the guest lecturer for a series of lectures where he goes into great detail in addition. So there's
Mm,
fascinating work that he's
yeah.
done. And so since then, I think research in neuroscience actually suggests that there are many attentional filters in the brain, just as James predicted. So we might ask, well, then what are those filters? So here are just some of them. The first are our sensory receptors, which are basically what I would say canalizing all the electromagnetic information of the universe into just five senses. The
Mm.
receptors from vision, from our auditory system, our taste, our touch, etc., our hearing. And then, after we have canalized the information to this small amount of the vibratory spectrum, then we have ascending tracks in our body up to the brain. One of them is called the ascending reticular activating system in our brainstem. And it filters even further because it allows only certain inputs to actually go to excite areas of the cortex so that they will be preferentially listened to by the cortex neurons.
Mm.
So that's the second level. Then in our midbrain, in the thalamus, we have another set of filters. And this was an interesting one. You can see why these are important to everyday life. So if I'm in a conversation at a cocktail party with a friend and there's a lot of noise going around me, and also a lot of visual information going on around me. And I'm trying to listen to what she has to say. What ends up happening is that my cortex says, wait a minute, I really need to focus on my friend's conversation. That's what I care
Mm.
about. And so it sends basically activation to particular nuclei in the thalamus to actually inhibit the part of the thalamus that is interested in visual inputs and other inputs, except for my friend's conversation. So we know that. I mean, you have those moments when you're listening so carefully to your friend and everything else is noisy, but you're not really paying attention.
Mm.
So that's the next filter, very important. Then we go up to the cortex. And now we have one of the key filters that is our biggest challenge to finding an expanded awareness. That's called the default mode network.
Yes.
So that network has five nuclei. The most important are what we call the medial prefrontal cortex, that's right about here, and the posterior cingulate cortex, right about here. This particular set of nuclei, the default mode network, is the source of our egoic roles that we play in the world, our narrative about who we are and how we relate to other people. And of course, it's important. It's sort of like the key to who we are in our physical body and how we relate to the world. And it filters out much of everything else that's going on around us. And I think you probably know this one as well. I can be, for example, out walking on a trail and I'm rehearsing some narrative from some particular conversation I had with my best friend, and we had some disagreement, and I'm giving her a new argument back in my head. Well, that is the default mode network and its narrative,
Mm.
along with another loop, which is called the thalamocortical loop, which reverberates the same conversations over and over again between your thalamus and your cortex. And that's called rumination, of course. We do it all the time. So I'm going to add one more set of networks, which I feel is also important, and that is our left versus our right brain filters. So again, your left brain is your conceptual side of the brain, your language centers. And I think this is an important point because what our language centers do when we decide to name something, for example, I decide to name a bird a robin. As soon as I name that bird a robin, I don't see the bird in the same way I saw it before. I have limited it down to like some stereotype of what a robin would be. And that happens with every single word we put in our vocabulary. We're not saying conceptuality is wrong, but we're saying it carves out a tiny part of existence to what we then pay attention to in naming all these aspects of the world. And here's an interesting example of that from Jill Bolte Taylor, who is a neuroanatomist that had a stroke to that left side of her brain. And she said when she had that stroke, she went, first of all, she lost her language abilities, but she said she went from feeling small and separate to expansive and just totally like ecstatic because she lost that narrowing down linear compartmentalizing and compartmentalizing
Mm.
aspect and now felt the wholeness, which is what your your right brain is about. Your right brain is about seeing the whole of nature as one. That's
Mm.
where our creativity tends to basically reside, along with its ability to analyze as well. So those
Mm.
are some of the main filters in the brain.
It seems like language limits us in this context, yes?
Absolutely. And in fact, that reminds me of something very important that Bernardo Kastrup and others have said about our human nervous system. And that is that when we want to understand what reality is, so now I'm putting on my materialist neuroscience
Okay.
cap. I want to understand reality. What I think I need to do is put into linear word narrative what is reality. And so then I say, okay, that's the atoms, it's the electrons, it's the protons, and the neutrons, and they combine and they create this reality. But what Bernardo Kastrup says is as soon as you put something into conceptuality, into words, you have gone away from the real gnosis, the understanding, the knowing of what is, because it cannot be put in words. And in
Mm.
fact, many of the perennial traditions say this. The Tao says that which can be actually put into words, that can be written, is not the Tao.
Yeah.
So anytime I try to put it into words, I have left something out. And so what it reminds me about as a neuroscientist is to try to accept that I will try to write things down, but realize that the truth of the universe is well beyond any conceptuality that I can imagine. I'm just pointing at a higher truth, but I'm
Mm.
not giving you the truth. So the scientists are pointing at a higher truth, not giving it to us. The perennial philosophers are pointing at a higher truth, not giving to us. And we have to then take what they say and see if that can help us see, for example, the moon that is beyond the pointing to the
Yes.
moon.
Yes. In another way, maybe to think of this, these maps are not the territory.
Exactly.
Yeah, gosh, so your Robin example, I think you reference it in the book too, is very helpful. Once
Yes.
we objectify the Robin with the name, we lose what I think it was Martin Buber called the I-thou relationship with the
Yes.
Robin. God, so interesting. Yeah. Am I correct in thinking the default mode network, the Buddhists refer to this as this is the monkey mind?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Chatter, chatter.
Chatter, chatter all day long. And something I want to mention, because the next point, of course, might be how we get rid of the filters. And what
Please.
I think
Yes,
is
let's go.
intriguing is the point we all have a monkey mind. And some people ask me, well, Marjorie, you said you meditate every day. They say, well, I can't meditate every day because I get frustrated. You know, my monkey mind is going on after 5 minutes. That's all I'm listening to. And I say, me too, but I have the patience to keep up with it day in and day out. And I also have the ability to just say to myself, I'll go ahead and meditate for at least 30 minutes because it takes me about 30 minutes to slow my mind down enough that I can experience something more expansive. So the
Mm.
issue is have perseverance, have faith that with practice, this can happen.
Yes, I love that. And before I forget to ask you this, do you have other colleagues who are neuroscientists who also engage in a daily meditation practice?
Absolutely, many
Okay.
of them.
You must have really fun conversations.
We do, but very often we're closet meditators, and it takes having coffee together to find out the other meditates.
Yes, I think our mutual colleague, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, is fond of sharing those stories of scientists who confront him quietly in the corner of the cocktail party and
Exactly.
confess all. Yeah, so interesting. Well, you wrote another book called The Playful Universe, um, the subtitle of which is Synchronicity and the Nature of Consciousness. And before we come around to consciousness in a little bit more detail, synchronicity, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so first of all, it was Carl Jung that invented that term, and it comes from two Greek phrases that he put together, in effect, syllables, syn, which means with or together, and then chronos, which means time. So basically, it's two events that are happening together in time, what we might call coincidentally. And the point is that they are two independent events that have no causal connection. But they are very meaningful to us in that moment when they come together and we go, oh my goodness, look at that. How could that be? So I'll just give you one example that we all know about. You're thinking of a friend, and all of a sudden the phone rings, and there's your friend on the phone. Those would be acausal. He says, so something else in the universe is something we are connected to and that is connecting us. And that's how these synchronicities happen.
Amazing. Um, I'm guessing I know the answer to this question, but I have to ask, are you witnessing synchronicities in your own life on a fairly regular basis, Marjorie?
I do, and it's sort of fun then. I want to take a step back. When I
Okay.
was a materialist neuroscientist and I heard the word synchronicity, I would shrug my shoulders, say, well, of course there are coincidences. There's so much going on in the world.
Yeah.
And so that was my attitude. But then when I became really someone curious about these things. And in fact, when I actually joined a group started by David Lorimer on synchronicities, where he brought like 15 of us together that eventually resulted in that book, I suddenly became very intrigued by this. And suddenly I would see example after example. I would sit down at my computer about to write a person an email to say, by the way, are you going to get back to me on that? And right then their email would come in saying, oh, yes, without my even asking. So I began to see them all the time. And I should say that then I also began seeing more meaningful ones. And I'll just give you one example from sort of my life as a young spiritual neuroscientist, we might say. And that is that one of my sabbaticals, I was able to go with my meditation teacher around the world to help give programs and courses and things like that. And at the very end of this sabbatical, I was back in the main meditation center where we were that summer. And she came into the office where I was working and she said to me, Marjorie, are you by any chance getting married? And I looked at her and I said, well, no, I have no interest in getting married because I couldn't travel like I'm doing right now with you if that were to happen. And she didn't say anything more to me. She went on to talk to someone else. But then a week after I returned home to Eugene, Oregon, I received this call from a man who'd heard about my meditation path. And he was interested in coming to a meditation program, which was at my home because I had a local meditation center there.
Hmm.
And so he came to the next program. And when he walked in the door and I saw him, I had the sense that we were going to get married. Now, of course, I didn't say anything. I'm the center leader. But about 7 weeks later, he stayed after everybody else had left. And he said, I have something to confess to you. And I said, well, what? And he said, I'm incredibly attracted to you. And I burst out laughing and I said, it took you long enough. And we were married the next summer. And now we've been married for 37 years. So, you might ask about why that seemed important to me. And I think it was partly that moment really caused a shift in my life, partly because I then became lovingly yoked to someone else with spirituality as a primary goal in their life. And I could really pursue it now together with this wonderful partner. My husband's name is Paul. And also because there are those moments when you cannot believe that a person like my teacher said something like, are you going to get married? That specific. And then you come home and somebody walks in the door and it's like, oh, that's what you were talking about.
It's such a good story. Is Paul a neuroscientist?
No, Paul is a literature teacher and he teaches writing and literature at a community college, Asian literature like Plato's Allegory of the Cave and things like that.
Perfect. You are a match made in heaven.
Yes.
Quite literally, it sounds like. Um,
Yes.
because some of our audience members are wondering right now, I'm sure. Okay, Marjorie, how do I open myself up to more synchronicity? How would you answer that question?
My own sense is, first of all, to be aware. And that's an interesting point that you say, because thinking about those filters of the brain now,
Mm,
what meditation is trying to get you to do is to turn down the default mode network narrative so that you can be present,
mm,
present every moment. I should
mm,
say this is something I am still working on.
mm.
I have friends that remind me that I talk quickly because I'm trying to do so much in my day. They say, slow down, be present. And even I get out of meditation in the morning, I'm totally present. And then what I have to do is keep that presence with me as I walk across the room to the kitchen to start breakfast and not be ahead of myself to wonder, what am I going to do in my day? That's what allows synchronicities to be actually observed. But
Mm.
it's what allows the vaster cosmos to be observed, and how difficult it is when that default mode network is in there saying, I have to do this and this and this. And once you start that, you're no longer present. And you're no longer also open to what I would call the information from the universe that you could actually use to actually help you be a more insightful, creative person.
So beautifully said. I use lists and language, Marjorie, to offload my tasks all the time so I can keep working or playing
And
in the
I
present.
have a
Yeah.
very good friend, meditator, that said that's what he does in meditation. He has his notebook there, and if a
Mm.
thought comes up, he writes it down and goes back to meditation.
Oh, I like that. I might have to try that. Yeah. Well, this next question comes from Ian, brother Ian, and I'm going to read it here because we spent a lot of time crafting this question for you. He writes this: consciousness precedes matter and gives birth to matter. This sounds like metaphysics, and yet it is a very serious and basic argument within science today. Can you, Marjorie, help us understand this notion that consciousness precedes matter and gives birth to matter? That
Yeah.
seems, well, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that that is now one of the key theories, we might say, models of the universe that more and more scientists that are intrigued by things like near-death experiences, et cetera, are really working on. And so it's this view of consciousness being fundamental that is expressed very well by two of our contemporary scientists. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about their views today. One is Bernardo Kastrup. He has two PhDs, one in philosophy, so he could really talk about the philosophy of consciousness being fundamental, and also in, I think it is computer science, et cetera. So he is one of the scientists, and the other one is Federico Fagin, who is a physicist from Italy, and he's the inventor of the microprocessor in Silicon Valley. So he is a billionaire by now because he made so much money on that. But he had an experience when he was trying to create a conscious computer many, many years ago. And in the middle of the night, had an experience that showed him, in fact, that you'll never make a computer conscious. And I'll share that experience with you too. But so I think that those are the two people that I'll talk a little bit about how they are understanding it, which resonates completely with my own experiences and my own background. So first of all, what they say, according to, we might call this analytic idealism or simply idealism in general. Idealism simply means consciousness is fundamental. I should mention that actually Max Planck, our venerable quantum physicist from the early 1900s, said exactly the same thing. He said, I believe consciousness is fundamental and matter is derivative from consciousness. So we're in good company. So saying that, consciousness is considered the basic substance of the universe, and thus this phenomenal universe is considered to be simply excitations of that consciousness. I love that word, excitations of that consciousness. And of course, what that means is that everything is in consciousness and it's made of consciousness. So we are in consciousness and we're made of consciousness. And now here's sort of a short version of Federico Faggine's model of reality, very similar to Bernardo Kastrup's and others. He says that it begins with the source of consciousness, which he calls the creative principle. He calls this the one consciousness, and he defines it as a unified quantum field. So we're already getting the physics in there, a unified quantum field. Now, he then gives general characteristics to this unified quantum field, and these, I'm sure, come from people's experience now of this. And he says it gives purpose, meaning, and direction to the universe. And it wants to know itself, to fulfill itself, and thus to enjoy and love its own existence. In other words, I see it as a playful, creative knowing, this fundamental consciousness field. And he says its essential and irreducible properties are conscious awareness, free will, wholeness, it's one, dynamism, it actually moves and creates, and life. So all of this is in his book called Irreducible that anyone can get and read. And then he says, in the process of knowing itself, it involves the creation of consciousness units, which he calls the parts whole of this one. And he says that every new self-knowing of this whole consciousness is an entity that represents the whole. And each one of these consciousness units is a different perspective on, and that's how the one knows itself. You and I are consciousness units. An electron or a proton is a consciousness unit. These are simply aspects of the one that then are created so that it can know itself. And I like that idea. So it's consciousness's way of knowing and realizing itself. It only can do it through us, meaning its consciousness units, which then, of course, have the next point is they have an interiority aspect and an exteriority aspect. Interiority is what it feels like to be an electron, what it feels like to be Rob or Marjorie. And then the exteriority is how we are seen from the other consciousness units across this veil of what appears to be a material universe, but it is excitations of consciousness. It's an illusion in what we see, but it's simply excitations of consciousness. So, that gives you a sense of its own self-knowing has to happen through all of us. And I think then what happens is that exteriority part happens in space-time. So we then create the illusion of space-time and exteriority in order to experience ourselves. And there we get that sense of experience, which I love. Someone once said, and I really believe it's true, that better even than the word consciousness or awareness would be experience is the fundamental nature of reality. When you think about it, it's what I'm experiencing right now with you is what I know about reality. And of course, my awareness gives me that experience. So maybe I'll just summarize what he said. So basically, consciousness is fundamental. It's causal. Physical reality is its manifestation. It's considered the universe is simply excitations of that consciousness. All conscious entities are linked or entangled. We're all one, as I said. So in fact, that's why I can have telepathy with you. And that's why, why can I know the future? Well, it's because space-time is just a creation. It's part of our illusion that we need to function in this particular reality where we are learning about ourselves through all of these experiences. And so consciousness not only also exists throughout the universe in electrons and everything, but throughout our body. So all my physiological processes in my body have a conscious interiority, as well as the exteriority of the things that I observe them doing. So I think that that gives you a bit of a sense. And I think that then what happens in meditation when we quiet the mind down is that we become more connected. We have more of a perception and awareness of that interconnection with all the other consciousness units of the universe because we are one. That's our essential nature. And that's the entanglement that often has been talked about in quantum physics.
Yes, and it makes the phrase participant observer a bit awkward. I think it works, but the way you've just so beautifully described this, you've done an end run, Marjorie, around the hard problem
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the so-called hard problem of consciousness.
yeah.
And I'm sensing that you are, I think, aligned with these two gentlemen. Um,
Absolutely. In fact, I am able to spend time with Federico Fagin at a number of conferences, including Science of Consciousness in Barcelona last year. And we're beginning to do actually some work together with Joan Walton and Laurel Waterman on consciousness education, because part of the issue is, okay, a number of people really understand this, but it's not taught in our educational system. It's not taught from elementary through junior, senior high schools or universities. So how are people going to access this?
yeah.
Um, is there a way that we can find to actually make this particularly interesting view of the world, which seems so real, acceptable to the atheist materialists or the fundamentalist religious people to say, look, there's nothing like unusual about this. This is
Yeah.
simply basic reality. You don't have to believe in a religion to really begin to understand this and put it into your life in a beautiful way.
Yeah. Have you engaged with Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or some of the so-called new atheists on this question at all?
I haven't, and I suppose I really should. I just have not yet. And I think partly when I have heard some people talk about Sam Harris, they say that he's equivocal sometimes about
Hmm.
his materialism versus consciousness being fundamental viewpoint. And I should probably go into this deeper to really try to understand exactly where he's coming from.
Well, as I'm sure you know, he fronts a very successful meditation app.
Yes, yes, I know.
Waking up, which is sort of ironic. But
Yes.
yeah, I wanted to ask you that. Well, I know we could talk all day, but I want to be mindful of your time. Can we end with the question about a more recent book, I think, a book you published called Spiritual Awakenings: Scientists and Academics Describe Their Experiences. Can you explain a little bit about what you learned from capturing, I think it was 47? Yeah.
57, but
Sorry,
yes.
57 interviews with scientists who are having spiritual awakenings. What did you learn?
Well, so, I mean, one of the first more broad things I learned was I simply looked at all of these 57 academic scientist
Hmm.
experiences, and I said, well, what are the different varieties of awakening that people may have to a broader awareness?
Hmm.
And so, just looking at that superficially, it was interesting that some of them happen through spiritual experiences like meditation, like mine did. Some of them happen spontaneously during their sleep. They would wake up in the morning or they would have a dream and they would have this amazing experience of a wider awareness, of being one with like light around them.
Hmm.
Some of them had it through psychedelic experiences, some of them through near-death experiences, and some of them even through reading a passage in a book. And one example was this wonderful man who was a physicist when he was beginning to do his work in his career and then became a philosopher, interestingly enough. After he went into the Boston Library. This is actually when he was in high school,
Hmm.
pulled a book off the shelf, opened it up. It came to Plato's Allegory of the Cave. He started reading it and he said the hairs on his body stood on end. And he like started tearing up.
Wow.
Like there was this part of him knew that it was true. He didn't understand it really at that moment, but he knew it was true. And that started
Hmm.
his spiritual journey. So it was like there was this transmission through the word. Fascinating. So that was one thing that was interesting.
Hmm.
But then when I looked at what might have preceded some of these experiences, one of the things I noticed is that there were sometimes events that preceded it, including something, for example, like a dark night of the soul in the person's life, that things were
Hmm.
going wrong in their life
Hmm.
and they didn't know how to deal with it. And I
Hmm.
should say that was somewhat the same for me, that
Yeah.
I was now a young neuroscientist. I got my PhD. I was beginning to go for a postdoc, and yet I felt high anxiety about the world. It's like I was doing all the right things. I was the right boyfriend, the right career. I had
Hmm.
a cute little house in the woods, all these things, and I was not happy.
Yeah.
It's like, what is missing? And I think that happened with many, many of the people. And in fact, Steve Taylor from the University of Leeds, I think it is in England, has written a book about that and many papers about that act, that event or sequence of events
Mm,
happening before a spiritual awakening. So I think that was certainly interesting to me. Like there's this mental turmoil about what is going on in my life.
mm,
So the other thing I think was interesting is a story, in fact, by Steve Taylor, where he said he was a musician as a young adult. And he actually went to Germany to live for a while. And he had been searching in his youth for understanding the real nature of reality.
mm.
But then he got into hedonism of being a musician. He was out late at night, smoking and drinking too much, surrounded by other people. I think we know that with a lot of people in their youth. And then he said what happened is he had become disconnected. But one night in Germany, this awakening came, and he said it was the most powerful experience of his life. He said he woke up in the middle of the night, no apparent reason, filled with this marvelous warm sense of well-being, he says. And he said the darkness around him seemed alive, and it was pervaded with this
Mm.
powerful, harmonious force. He felt it was the essence and the source of all things. So that's then what got him
Wow.
back. It's like, oh my God, I forgot. And then he was back on his spiritual path. So those
Mm,
are some of the things that I've certainly noticed. I also believe the other thing that's critical is that either before the event, through practices, or during the event, there is this stilling of the narrative mind. You have to
mm,
like let go of those stories of
mm.
your egoic default mode network about who you are, because that's the only way this higher like awareness of your unity with a greater reality seems to be able to come through. And so, again, sometimes it was like in that moment, waking up from sleep, he was in that quiet state and that could come through. It's like there's this crack in your egoic narrative.
Yes, our egos, our isms, our ologies, they get in the way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Last question. If you could offer one nugget of wisdom, strategic advice to the human species at this very strange and interesting moment for for us, what would that be?
I think it would probably be to find some practice, whatever that might be. And again, we don't even have to name it anyway, but simply that allows you to quiet your mind. One
Mm,
of the things that I highly recommend to people is just being in nature as much as you can. When I'm in nature, my mind quiets down and I feel my interconnection with the things around me. And then be curious. It's like I used to think that everything around me, because I was a materialist neuroscience, was sort of robotically created. It wasn't alive in the sense that I'm alive, that humans are alive. Now I understand that my cat is an absolutely exquisite sentient being who can communicate with me in very interesting ways. Trees and birds and other things around me also have that same ability to communicate. Something someone said to me, which I love, was every time you stop and thank a tree for being there, it remembers that for 500 years. Now, I love that notion. I can't prove it's true or not, but I feel then the connection that we are all here to help and support each other and nurture each other as we move forward as humanity with the rest of this planet. That's going to be key to
mm,
being able to keep ourselves in a beautiful space and to nurture the planet and not destroy ourselves in the process.
mm. Marjorie, where should people go to find more about you and your work?
Well, certainly they can go to my own website, marjoriewoollacott.com, and also go to Amazon with my name, and you'll see the various books that I've edited and published. Also, I would suggest some different organizations. One is the Association for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. I actually edit those books, and then we have beautiful member conversations, discussions with the authors of the essays. And so people can discuss this with the authors themselves. We have great conversations together. The Galileo Commission is another great place for people
Mm.
to go and become a member, where we have similar sorts of events. And also International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm the actually research director, and we have meetings every year. And compared to my ordinary scientific meetings, these are the most filled meetings in the world. I love them.
Oh, so amazing. You are leading a full and powerful life. And Dr. Marjorie Woollacott, on behalf again of Ian and Michael and Philip Baldwin and the Marion Institute, thank you so much
Thank
for being our guest today. Can we do this again? Have a part two?
I'd love to. I'd love to.
Okay, that would be great. Well, thanks, and we will talk again soon.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Three Brothers Quest. We are in the requesting room with Ian and Michael and Philip Baldwin. Today, exploring Dr. Marjorie Woollacott's work, specifically her pioneering research around consciousness, and just mentioning her book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, in which she chronicles her own journey as a neuroscientist and as a lifelong meditator together. So, gentlemen, Marjorie Woollacott, what did you make of her notion of consciousness? Take it wherever you wish.
Well, I guess I'll start in light of the silence from my two confrères. Uh, as always, well, no, let me rephrase that. I found her riveting. I thought the interview was riveting. And her style, her animation, her enthusiasm, her precision were all very gratifying. And everything she had to say, I thought was fascinating. But to cut to the chase, to cut to the things that kind of gripped me. First of all, the issue of the fear of death. And she pointed out, which I think a lot of us already knew, but that when people have near-death experiences and they come back, they no longer fear death. And the implication being that, well, they've looked over the other side and they're still there, and there's their family and their mothers and their grandmothers and who all else. And life appears to be pretty cool. I've trouble with that. It strikes me as, I don't know, do I want my mother to be hanging around in eternity to chat with me? I love my mother. She's a great lady, but she assured me when she died that she was heading on to another galaxy. So, I don't mean to make light of this. It's an extremely serious subject, but there is it does the near-death thing and our attraction to the near-death subject have a lot to do with our fear of death because it reassures us as a concept. So that's one thing I wanted to sort of throw out there to chew on. And then the next thing, I think she said that it could be, I wrote this down as a reflection about the brain filtering out a wider awareness but I noted there's experience and there's proof, and the two don't have anything to do with each other. And a lot of this conversation is, and this comes up again and again in different areas of, this comes up with Paul Levy, it comes up with Mauro Bellino, it comes up again and again. This, I don't want to say desperate, but this yearning for our being able to prove these things that we find so fascinating. We want proof, but it's not going to do us any good at the end of the day. Because as she said, it's experience that is the nub of the matter. Gnosis comes through experience. Expressing what it is just expressing what it is, which I actually thought was or I think as she put it, pointing to a higher truth is not the truth itself, which I thought was brilliant. I'll stop.
Thank you, Philip. I did front load our conversation with Marjorie with the near-death experience question for two reasons. One, I know that the brothers would have a lively riposte about the NDEs, but also I listened to a lot of Marjorie's interviews with other podcast interviewers, and I wanted to shake her out of kind of the story I heard her tell and the flow of her story over and over again by just beginning with something really provocative, like the NDE. And I think it worked in this instance. I'll stop there, but you brought it up, Philip, so I just wanted to mention that.
Oh.
Well, you want me to go in? You want to go in? Well, I'm with you, Philip. I'm with you. I think that what you led off with is exactly what I think is the crux: this fear of death, and having some knowledge of the way Tibetans are brought up and Buddhism. Of course, they make death a conversation from the very get-go. And I've watched these lamas have hysterics over people's fear of death. They think, or even when they're sick, they think it's amusing because this little body and this little moment on this planet is basically so insignificant in its way. And I think that I think they've done a great deal of study and research about the fear of death, so that if you have the fear of death, I'm going to read, it makes you selfish. The more we fear death, the more we cling to ourselves, our belongings, our safe spaces, to that which is familiar. And it goes on. We flout authority, ignore social mores, steal from others to provide for ourselves, and become more materialistic. And when you don't have that fear, the opposite comes to pass, which is a great deal more altruism, compassion, community building, etc. And I think there's some proof around that. So for me, when you dive in, if everybody could dive in to a little bit of understanding about, yes, NDEs, ESP, precognition, remote viewing, coarse morphic resonance, and Rupert Sheldrake, and I always have adored, and we've discussed before, if you do your crossword puzzle in the morning, you're going to do so-so, or you're going to have some sort of accomplishment. But if you do it in the evening or the next morning, you're going to do much better, because so many other people have been doing that crossword puzzle, and it's transmitting itself through the morphic resonance. And these are studies. It's like the doggy knowing when the master's coming home. How? So the non-local consciousness and the brain is a receiver of this vast field of knowledge and information. I think if we could get people to get into this and study it a bit and to get exposed to it a bit, the confidence over the survival of consciousness is really important. That's all.
Beautifully said, Michael. Ian.
Well, we agreed, I think, to just talk when we felt like talking.
Yeah.
I don't really feel like talking, but I will. I'll try. Michael mentioned the Buddhists and the Lamas, Tibetan. And of course, the Tibetans' concept of the funnel between this life and the next, they call a bardo. And I think, if I recollect correctly, you're in the bardo for 49 days. And there's no mention of this in Marjorie's clinical work. But the bardo experience is something that I'd be very interested to hear her talk about.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing the Tibetan Lamas say is that the transfer across the gulf between this life and the next or the next incarnation, if you didn't go up in a rainbow body, jaloux, can be very terrifying. That's what I took from my years working with Tibetan Buddhists. So I know that the clinical work that Marjorie has done, which is fabulous work, and others before her and simultaneously with her, there's a white light, it's not a cozy, it's a reassuring, reaffirming experience. I think all of us are on this quantum wavelength in this group where consciousness is primary and indestructible.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can explain just how it's indestructible, but that is the premise, and that is, Philip said, proof versus experience. I like that distinction. But I think it's both being proven and certainly experienced in the work that Marjorie and other neuroscientists do. For me, experience is primary. I almost don't give a shit about proof. So much is made of proof. It's my experience. I had an experience recently of a dream about, maybe I was thinking of us doing this together, of being with my brothers in a kind of white shell in Buzzards Bay, which we all grew up on. And there were two very amusing details. One was the complete beauty of the water. The water was very dark, but it was not frightening. I have never seen water like it. It was just black and quite, I don't know what the word is, but not black and terrifying. And the amusing thing was the lip of the little shell or boat we were in was not that far above the water, meaning to me it meant you're not far from dipping into that. And it was a lovely dream because I woke up reassured in a way, in my own way, and in my own experience. But this business of contrasting experience, which one hears of terrifying death experiences through the tradition of the Tibetan Buddhists, and then one hears of beautiful experiences. And for me, the judge is out. That's all I'll say.
I have to.
Yeah, and I think also, Ian, I think be also interesting to ask Marjorie, because I remember, the first person we had at the Marian Institute conference was Dr. Kenneth Ring, whom she refers to. And he was sort of the beginner of NDEs. And there's a lot of work that shows you they're not all sweetness and light.
Yes.
And I also think so much of your initial experience that gets recorded in an NDE or out-of-body experience, whatever, can be predicated by your degree of fear or your belief system. So I think that we got to be very careful about a uniform experience that's always going to be sort of divine, or in the case of the Tibetans, rather difficult to the old bardo. I don't like.
Yeah.
I don't. So there's just a little.
Yes, I think
no, but that's very good. I think
point.
that's very important what you just said.
Absolutely.
That it is driven by the degree of fear. I suspect that's correct. Of course, I don't know.
Oh no, I know, and that's why it's, anyway.
That's I wonder if we might talk for a second. I'm not segueing far away about synchronicity, um, because I don't know about you guys, but I love synchronicity. And
Mhm.
I observe when I have them. And it's precisely when I'm more inclined to be in those frames of mind that how does she put it? Turn down the default mode network, be present. That'll bring you to more synchronicity. And you don't get synchronicities when you're, racing at 100 miles an hour and meeting deadlines and so forth. But if you're in the right frame of mind, suddenly they start popping up. And I'm assuming I'm correct if I say all of us have had gazillions of them.
Sure.
And yet, as a species in the Western world, we just refuse to acknowledge the possibility of such things. And this came up repeatedly in her talk, which is the programming of our secular materialist scientific mindset so blocks out these possibilities. Although we also know when you probe a little with just about anybody, there are cracks, and they are aware of and can think of experiences. They may cast it off as just a statistical accident, but nevertheless, they happen to them. And if we talk about a real consciousness shift, you could like to imagine a world in which everybody embraced synchronicities. And that would be a dramatic change in our cultural mindsets, and somehow a realistic change to hope for. Anyway,
It's good.
that out.
Yep.
I think I'm hoping one day we'll interview Rob, Ian McGilchrist, because the right brain experiences existence so differently from the left. And of course, we have that connector called the corpus callosum or whatever. And that's the point of the brain, is how do we integrate it? And I believe McGilchrist says, well, the left has risen up and carries a bullwhip over its former master. But I think, Philip, this synchronicity is, as far as the us Westerners goes, was a big thing for Carl Jung.
Yeah.
And
Right.
he brought it into Western thinking. And I think when we're in the right brain mode, whether we realize it or not, that's when we.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And if we're left brain, it's not that we can't be and shouldn't be left brain moded. It's how do we bounce out of that and integrate. And this also is somehow, I'm not sure how, related to the approach to one's death.
Yeah, good one. Good one. Ian.
Yeah, beautifully said.
That's good.
I know we're almost at time.
Yeah.
As I'm listening to the four of us reflect here, I'm reminded that Marjorie, like all of the women we've interviewed for the Three Brothers Quest, really offers I'll use the word concrete path forward for practical daily experience.
Yeah.
To bridge the gap between the left and the right brains, the scientific and the more, shall we say, mysterious. As a lifelong meditator, Marjorie gets up and the first thing she does is not go to the lab. First thing she does is meditate.
Yeah.
Daring more or less said the same thing. Anna Reitorts more or less said the same thing. Lynn McTaggart more or less said the same thing. So I love this notion, and maybe we end here,
Good.
of how we blend the left and the right brains, to use McGilchrist and Ian's admonition. And I'm just looking at Marjorie's website. The homepage at the top is a single question. Very simple. Marjorie's website, Marjorie asks, what if consciousness is the essence of the universe?
Great.
And maybe that brings us full circle to what,
Super.
yeah.
Super duper.
Should we interview her again sometime?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
I think most of I like to think that we are in the process of building slowly a community of, for lack of a better word, and there is a better word, but I can't think of it, informants.
Agreed. I'd love to see her in conversation with all of our other guests, but yeah, maybe that will happen someday.
Good.
Others, thank you, as always.
Thank you, Bob.
Yes.
Thank you, Roberto.
Yes, and can't wait till our next conversation in the great requesting room.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Ciao.
Bye, everyone.
See you.
Ciao.
Thanks.